The red dust of the Arizona territory did not just sit on the skin, it bit into it, finding its way into pores, eyes, and the very soul of anyone foolish enough to cross the border. It was the year 1887, and the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the roof of the battered stagecoach as it lurched toward the town of Dustwater. Inside the coach, Lydia Hart sat with her spine pressed against the hard leather seat, her posture rigid, a habit drilled into her by 20 years of unforgiving Eastern etiquette. She was a woman composed of lace collars and high-buttoned shoes, a creature of drawing rooms and needlepoint, entirely unsuited for the savage vastness of the West. Yet, her jaw was set with a tension that threatened to snap the delicate bones of her face. Her gloved hand clutched a reticule in her lap. Inside it lay a letter, folded and refolded so many times the paper had begun to disintegrate at the creases. She did not need to take it out to read it. The words were branded into her memory in her mother's desperate, looping script. "You have no choice. You must marry him to save this family. Your father's debts are insurmountable. Mr. Crowley is a man of means, and he has asked for you. Do not be selfish. Lydia, do not let your pride destroy us." Lydia closed her eyes against the glare of the sun cutting through the window. Selfish. They called her selfish because she refused to be sold like prize livestock to a man whose eyes held the warmth of a reptile. She was a virgin, untouched and unknowledgeable in the ways of men. But she possessed an instinct for survival that the polite society of Boston had failed to breed out of her. The stagecoach driver shouted, and the vehicle slowed, the wheels groaning in protest. Through the dust-streaked window, the town of Dustwater emerged from the heat haze like a collection of bleached bones. It was a rough settlement, a scar on the landscape where the ambitious and the desperate converged. Wooden buildings leaned against one another for support. The air smelled of manure, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of copper. Lydia stepped down from the coach, her legs trembling from 3 days of travel. The heat hit her like a physical blow. She smoothed her gray traveling dress, conscious of how out of place she looked. Men on the boardwalk stopped to stare. Their gazes were heavy, stripping away the layers of her clothing. But she kept her chin high. She was not safe here. She knew that, but she was safer here than she was back east, standing at the altar beside Silas Crowley. She moved quickly to the shaded overhang of the general store, needing to get her bearings. It was there, while pretending to examine a barrel of dry beans, that the reality of her situation truly struck her. 2 men were leaning against the hitching post nearby, their voices low but carrying in the stillness of the afternoon. "I hear Crowley is coming out personally next month," one man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Says the railroad timeline is lagging." "It is not the railroad he is worried about," the second man replied with a dark chuckle. "He is looking for something he lost. A woman, they say. Heard he is tearing up the telegraph lines from here to St. Louis asking about her." Lydia froze, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silas Crowley. The name itself seemed to darken the bright sun. He was not just a rejected suitor. He was the primary power in this territory. He was the railroad baron whose iron rails were slicing through the Apache lands, a man who bought politicians and sheriffs as easily as he bought cigars. She had fled a marriage to him, but in doing so, she had run straight into the heart of his kingdom. "He will find her," the first man said. "Crowley always gets what he owns." Lydia turned away, her breath catching in her throat. She needed to hide. The hotel was too public. A boarding house would ask questions. She needed a place where no one would look for a well-bred white woman. She drifted toward the edge of town, near a dilapidated saloon where the noise was loudest, thinking she might find a carriage for hire to take her further west, perhaps to California. The saloon was dark and smelled of stale beer. She did not go in, but lingered near the open door, listening to the rough voices spilling out. "Who would be crazy enough to take that land?" a voice boom inside asked. "Only Taza," another voice answered, the name spoken with a mixture of derision and grudging respect. "That half-blood thinks he can run cattle on the devil's anvil." He is stubborn as a mule and meaner than a rattlesnake. He is Apache, the first voice dismissed, or at least enough of one to make the cavalry nervous. Lives out by the Red Canyon, keeps to himself, says he answers only to the wind and his horses. Crowley hates him. Says Taza is squatting on prime water rights. Lydia listened, her mind racing. An outcast, a man hated by Silas Crowley, a man who wanted to be left alone. It was a madness born of desperation that formed the idea in her mind. If this man, this Taza, was an enemy of Crowley, perhaps he would not be quick to hand her over. If he lived in isolation, perhaps she could disappear there, just for a little while, until she could secure passage to the coast. She turned to leave, but she bumped into an older man hauling a crate of empty bottles out the side door. He was withered, with skin like dried tobacco leaves and one cloudy eye. He stopped and looked at her, his good eye narrowing. "You are new in town, miss," he said. It was not a question. "I am just passing through," Lydia said, gripping her reticule tighter. The old man leaned in, his breath sour. Passing through is dangerous business these days, especially for a lady who looks like she does not belong to the dust. He paused, looking around as if checking for listeners, then lowered his voice to a rasping whisper. "There is a poster up in the sheriff's office. Just came in on the wire. Silas Crowley is offering $500 for information on a runaway bride. Blonde hair, green eyes. Looks mighty fancy for these parts." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a farm or drink a man to death for 5 years. "I do not know what you are talking about," she whispered, her voice trembling. The old man smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "I am sure you do not, miss, I am sure you do not, but folks in this town, they get hungry, and $500 buys a lot of meals. If I were you, I would not let the sun set on me in dust water." He did not raise the alarm. Perhaps he was waiting to see where she went, to sell the information for a higher price later, or perhaps he just enjoyed the terror in her eyes. Lydia did not wait to find out. She backed away, then turned and walked as fast as her dignity would allow toward the edge of town. She had no horse, she had very little money, but she knew where the Red Canyon lay. She had seen the jagged crimson scar on the horizon from the stagecoach window. She began to walk. The heat was merciless. Her boots, designed for carpeted parlors, offered little protection against the sharp rocks and scorching earth. She walked for 2 hours, the town fading into a smudge behind her. Her throat was parched, her heavy skirts dragging in the sand like lead weights. She heard the gunfire before she saw it. It was a sharp, cracking sound, distinct from the dull roar of the wind. Lydia dropped to her knees instinctively, crawling behind a cluster of large boulders. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs. Peering around the edge of the stone, she saw a wooden fence line stretching across a scrubby patch of desert. Beyond it lay a modest ranch house and a corral. 3 men on horseback were circling the perimeter, their faces obscured by bandanas. They were firing at the house and at the cattle that milled about in a panic. "Come out, Redskin," one of the riders shouted. "Crowley says it is time to move on." The answer came from the roof of the ranch house. A single shot rang out, clean and precise. The hat of the shouting rider flew off his head, spinning in the air before landing in the dirt. The rider yelped and ducked low over his saddle. From the shadows of the porch, a figure emerged. He moved with a fluidity that seemed unnatural, staying low, a Winchester rifle tucked against his shoulder. This was Taza, even from a distance. Lydia could see he was different from the men in town. He wore the denim trousers and leather chaps of a cowboy, but his shirt was buckskin, and his dark hair hung long and loose past his shoulders, held back by a simple cloth band. He did not shout back. He did not curse. He simply worked the lever of his rifle with terrifying speed. Crack! Crack! Dust kicked up inches from the hooves of the lead horse. The animal reared, throwing the rider's aim. Taza was not shooting to kill. Lydia realized with a jolt, he was shooting to herd them, just as one would herd cattle. He was driving them back. "Damn it," one of the gunmen screamed as a bullet shattered the wooden post next to his head. sending splinters flying into his face. "Pull back! He dug in too deep!" The riders wheeled their horses around, firing wild, ineffective shots over their shoulders as they galloped away into the shimmering heat. Taza did not chase them. He stood his ground, the rifle still raised, watching until they were nothing but dust motes in the distance. Only then did he lower the weapon. Lydia remained behind the rock, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had seen violence before. In the polite, crushing way men like Crowley destroyed their rivals in business. But she had never seen raw, physical combat. It terrified her. And yet, there was something about the way the Apache rancher stood there alone, silent, victorious against 3 men that pulled at her. He was a survivor, like her. She waited until the silence of the desert returned, heavy and absolute. Then, she stood up. Her legs felt like water. She brushed the red dust from her skirt, though it was a futile effort, and stepped out from behind the boulder. She began to walk toward the house. Taza sensed her before he saw her. He spun around, the rifle snapping back up to his shoulder in a blur of motion. The bore of the weapon was a dark eye staring straight at her chest. Lydia stopped, raising her empty hands. "Do not shoot!" she cried out, her voice cracking with thirst. Taza did not lower the gun. He narrowed his eyes, scanning the horizon behind her for a trap. When he saw no one else, his gaze settled on her. He looked at her dusty, expensive dress, her sunburned face, her trembling hands. His expression was hard, carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with a profound wariness. "You are lost, white woman," he said. His English was perfect, his voice deep and rough, like gravel shifting in a riverbed. "Town is that way, 5 miles. He gestured with the barrel of the rifle back the way she had come. "I am not lost," Lydia said, taking a tentative step forward. "I came looking for you." Taza laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No one comes looking for me unless they want to kill me or cheat me. Which one are you?" "I am neither," Lydia said. She forced herself to meet his gaze. He was handsome in a severe, terrifying way. His face held the sharp angles of his ancestors, but his stance was that of a man who had ridden the range all his life. "I need a job." Taza lowered the rifle an inch, his brow furrowing. "A job." He looked her up and down with open skepticism. "Look at you. You are a city girl. You would not last one day out here. The sun would cook you, and the coyotes would eat what is left." "I can work," Lydia insisted, though her voice wavered. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend clothes. I do not need a maid. I need a hand who can rope a steer and fix a fence. Can you do that?" Lydia swallowed hard. "I can learn." "Go home," Taza said, turning his back on her. "I have enough trouble with Crowley's men. I do not need a stray kitten dying on my porch. I cannot go back." The desperation in her voice stopped him. Lydia took another step, ignoring the warning glare he cast over his shoulder. "I have nowhere else to go. Please." She did not tell him about Crowley. She did not tell him about the bounty. If he knew she was worth $500, he might drag her back to town himself. Or worse, if he knew she was connected to the man trying to steal his land, he might shoot her where she stood. Taza turned fully around to face her. He studied her face. He saw the fear there, yes, but beneath it, he saw something else. He saw the same look he had seen in the eyes of a wild mare before she was broken, a fierce, panicked refusal to be captured. He walked slowly toward her, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He stopped 3 feet away. He smelled of sagebrush, gunpowder, and horse sweat. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why come to the Apache?" "Because they say you do not bow to anyone," Lydia answered softly. Taza stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretched, filled only by the wind whistling through the fence posts. He looked at her blistered skin, her determined jaw. He knew he should send her away. She was in trouble. She was soft. She was everything he had walked away from when he left the Army Scouts. But he also knew what it was like to be hunted. 3 days, Taza said abruptly. "You can stay in the barn. You work for your food. If you are useless, you go back to town, If you complain, you go back to town." Lydia let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Taza muttered, turning back toward the house. "You have not seen the work yet." He walked away, leaving her standing in the yard. Lydia looked down at her hands. They were shaking, but they were free. She looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and blood orange. She was tired, she was terrified, and she was in the house of a man the whole town feared. But for the first time in weeks, she was not property. She picked up her skirts and followed him toward the barn. The first 3 days at the Apache ranch were a brutal education in the frailty of the human body. Lydia Hart, whose hands had previously known only the weight of a silver tea service or an embroidery needle, found herself engaged in a war with the elements, and she was losing. Her gray traveling dress, once the height of Boston fashion, was now stained with sweat and the ubiquitous red dust that coated everything in the territory. She hauled water from the pump near the house to the horse trough, the wooden buckets tearing at the skin of her palms until raw blisters formed and burst. She learned to shovel manure from the stalls, choking back the bile that rose in her throat at the smell, while the horses watched her with large, indifferent eyes. Taza did not help her. He watched her from the periphery of his own work, his dark eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He broke wild mustangs in the round pen, his body moving in a violent, graceful rhythm with the bucking animals, a silent testament to a strength Lydia could not comprehend. When he passed her in the yard, he offered no words of encouragement, only a curt nod if she had completed a task to his satisfaction, or a sharp click of his tongue if she had not. He was waiting for her to break. Lydia knew it. He expected the city girl to crumble under the weight of the sun and the isolation, to pack her bag and flee back to the safety of civilization. But Lydia Hart had nowhere to run. On the 4th night, the silence of the desert was broken by the sound of hoofbeats. Lydia, who had been trying to mend a tear in her skirt by the dim light of a kerosene lamp in the barn, froze. She blew out the light and pressed herself against the rough wood of the stall door. Peering out through a crack, a single rider approached the main house. He did not ride like a white man. He sat loose and easy, merging with the movement of the horse. Taza stepped out onto the porch to meet him. "Nokai," Taza said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin night air. The rider dismounted. He was an Apache man, older than Taza, with deep lines etched around his mouth and a Winchester rifle scabbard lashed to his saddle. They spoke in their native tongue at first, a fluid, guttural exchange that Lydia could not understand. But then Nokia switched to English, his tone urgent. "The men who hit the fence line," Nokai said. "I tracked them back to the edge of town. They are on the payroll of the railroad." Lydia felt a cold hand grip her heart. "Crowley." Taza spat the name like a curse. "Silas Crowley wants the water." "Taza," Nokai continued, "the survey maps show the aquifer runs deepest right under this valley. The steam engines need water to cross the desert. Without your wells, his line stalls 50 miles east. He is not just trying to scare you, he is trying to dry you out." Taza remained silent for a long moment, looking out at the dark expanse of his land. "He can try. This land remembers my grandfather's blood. It will not yield to iron rails. He is offering money to the town council to condemn the property," Nokai warned. "And he is looking for something else. A woman. Rumor is he lost a prize filly, and he thinks she ran west." Lydia pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The two threads of danger she had thought were separate, her flight from marriage and Taza's war for his land, were actually the same noose. Tightening around both their necks, Silas Crowley was the spider in the center of the web. The next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Taza was gone before sunrise, riding the perimeter of the ranch. Lydia finished her chores with a mechanical efficiency, her mind racing. She needed supplies, soap, thread, and coffee, and she needed to know what the town was saying. She hitched the old mare to the buckboard wagon, a task that took her 20 minutes of struggling with the leather harness. When Taza returned at mid-morning, he saw the wagon ready. I need supplies, Lydia said. Her chin lifted in defiance before he could object. And I have my own money to pay for them. Taza looked at her, his expression unyielding. Dustwater is not a friendly place for you right now. I am not afraid of gossip. She lied. It is not gossip I am worried about. Taza grunted. However, he did not stop her. He simply checked the rifle in the scabbard attached to the wagon seat. Keep your head down. Do not linger. The drive to Dustwater felt longer than the 5 miles it measured. When Lydia rolled the wagon onto the main street, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Men stopped mid-stride to stare. Women, clutching their parasols, turned their heads and whispered behind gloved hands. Lydia kept her eyes fixed on the ears of the mare, guiding the wagon to the general store. As she climbed down, she heard a voice, loud and distinct. "That is her, the squaw man's whore!" Lydia stumbled slightly but caught herself. Her face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. She had preserved her virtue her entire life. She had guarded it like a treasure, believing it was the only thing of value a woman possessed in this world. And yet, here she was, stripped of her reputation simply because she had sought shelter under the roof of an Apache. She walked into the store, her spine stiff. The shopkeeper, a balding man with nervous eyes, served her in silence, placing her items on the counter with trembling hands. He did not look her in the eye. "That will be $2, he muttered. Lydia placed the coins on the counter. As she turned to leave, the door opened, blocking the light. Sheriff Briggs stood in the doorway. He was a large man, his belly straining against the buttons of his vest, a tin star pinned carelessly to his chest. He smelled of whiskey and stale tobacco. He did not move to let her pass. "Miss Hart," Briggs said. He knew her name. Lydia clutched her parcel to her chest. "Sheriff." "You are a hard woman to track down," Briggs said, stepping closer. The space in the doorway seemed to shrink. "But then, I suppose it is easy to hide when you crawl into a savage's bed." "I am working at the ranch," Lydia said, her voice icy. "I am an employee," Briggs laughed. A wet, unpleasant sound. "Is that what we are calling it, working?" He reached out and brushed a finger against the sleeve of her dress. Lydia recoiled as if burned. "Silas Crowley is a worried man. Miss Hart, he is worried about your safety. He thinks you have been abducted." "I was not abducted. I left. Crowley does not see it that way." Briggs dropped his voice to a low rumble. His eyes raked over her, stripping away her dignity. "He wants you back, and he is a man who pays well for the return of his property. He is coming here, you know, to settle the land dispute, to collect what is his." "I am not his property," Lydia whispered, though the fear was rising in her throat like bile. "Everything in this territory is his property. Eventually," Briggs sneered. "Even that patch of dirt Taza calls a ranch. You think that Indians can protect you, he cannot even protect himself. When Crowley gets here, he will burn that place to the ground. And if you are there when the match is struck," he let the threat hang in the air. "Why don't you come stay at the hotel? I can keep an eye on you until Mr. Crowley arrives. It would be safer." The implication was clear. Briggs was offering a different kind of cage, one just as degrading as the gossip outside. Lydia pushed past him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Get out of my way!" She fled to the wagon, scrambling onto the seat with unladylike haste. She whipped the reins, and the mare bolted forward, kicking up dust. Behind her, she could hear Briggs laughing. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of terror. The reality of her position had shattered whatever illusions of independence she had harbored. She was alone. The law was bought. The town despised her. And Silas Crowley was coming. If she stayed as she was a transient, a hired hand, a runaway girl, she would be plucked from Taza's land the moment Crowley arrived. Briggs would arrest her. Or Crowley would claim spousal rights based on the betrothal contracts her father had signed. She needed to be something more. She needed to be irrevocable. By the time the ranch house came into view, the sun was setting. painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Taza was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of ironwood. He stopped when she pulled the wagon up, watching her with that same intense, guarded expression. Lydia unhitched the horse and put her away, her hands trembling not from exertion, but from the magnitude of the decision forming in her mind. It was madness. It was social suicide. But it was the only weapon she had left. She walked to the porch. The night air was cooling, the crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Taza did not look up from his knife. "You were gone a long time," he said quietly. "I met the sheriff," Lydia said. She stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at him. Taza's hands still. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Briggs. What did he say?" "He told me Silas Crowley is coming." Taza drove the knife into the wood of the step with a sudden, violent motion. "I know. He thinks I'm your whore. Taza." Taza stood up slowly. He towered over her on the steps, his silhouette framed by the starlight. "Let them talk. Words are wind." "It is not just words," Lydia cried out, the desperation cracking her composure. "Crowley claims I belong to him. My father signed papers. In the eyes of their law, I am a runaway asset. If they come here, they will take me, and they will use my presence as an excuse to destroy you." "Let them come," Taza said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have bullets for them." "Bullets will not stop a railroad baron." Lydia stepped up onto the porch, invading his space. She needed him to see her, not as a nuisance, not as a charity case, but as a force. "Crowley wants this land for the water, but he wants me for his pride. He wants to own everything. If I am just a guest here, he takes me. If I am just a worker, he takes me." "Then leave," Taza said, turning away. "Go to California. I will give you a horse." "No!" The word hung in the air, absolute and final. Taza turned back, surprised by the steel in her voice. "I'm not running anymore," Lydia said. She took a breath, the night air filling her lungs, sharp and clean. She thought of her mother's letter. She thought of Briggs's leering face. She thought of the way Taza looked when he stood between her and the gunman, like a part of the earth itself. Unmovable. She needed to be unmovable. "I have a proposition," she said. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. Taza watched her, his face impassive, though a muscle feathered in his jaw. "I have no money to pay you more." "I do not want money." Lydia stepped closer. She could smell the scent of him leather, smoke, and the wild, open desert. She looked straight into his black eyes. "I want to stay, permanently. I want to be so bound to this place, and to you, that no law of white men can tear me away without tearing the heart out of this land." Taza frowned, confusion clouding his gaze. "What are you saying?" Lydia reached out, her hand hovering near his arm but not touching. She was a virgin. She knew nothing of the act of love, only the whispered horrors and duties her mother had hinted at. But she knew the power of bloodlines. She knew that in the West, and especially among the Apache, a child was a bond deeper than any paper contract. "Crowley wants a legacy," she said softly. "He wants to breed me like a prize mare to secure his dynasty. That is why he is obsessed." She took a step closer, until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the stars. "I will carry your child," she vowed. Taza flinched as if she had struck him. His eyes widened, shock cracking his stoic mask. Lydia did not retreat. She pressed on, her voice gaining strength from the sheer audacity of her offer. "If I must belong to any man in this land, let it be one who belongs to the earth, not to greed. Let it be you." Silence crashed down on the porch, heavy and suffocating. Taza stared at her, his breath catching in his chest. He looked at her face pale, terrified, yet fierce. He knew she was untouched. It was written in the way she held herself, in the nervous flutter of her pulse at her throat. She was offering him the one thing society told her was her only value. She was offering to destroy her name, her future, her soul in the eyes of her God, just to stay on his land. "You do not know what you are saying," Taza said, his voice raspy. He stepped back, putting distance between them. You are innocent. You do not know what that means. I know that if I carry your child, I am Apache, Lydia said. I know that if I carry your child, I am the mother of this land's future. Crowley cannot claim a woman who carries the blood of his enemy. It would poison his reputation. He would cast me aside. And you would be an outcast, Taza said harshly. Forever. A white woman with a half-breed child. They would spit on you in the street. They already do, Lydia cried. I would rather be an outcast with you than a queen in Crowley's hell. Taza turned his back to her, gripping the porch railing until his knuckles turned white. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a war drum he had not heard in years. He had closed himself off after the army betrayed his scouts, after his family was pushed onto the reservation. He had sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. But this woman, this terrifying, foolish, brave woman was offering him something he thought he had lost forever. A future, a legacy, a connection to the world that was not just war and survival. A child is not a bargain. Lydia, he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. He did not turn around. It is not a shield you pick up when you're scared. It is not fear, Lydia said. She moved to stand behind him, close enough that her breath stirred the hair at the nape of his neck. It is a choice, my choice, for the first time in my life. Taza closed his eyes. He could feel the warmth of her. He could feel the terrifying pull of her offer. To plant a seed in the earth of this valley. To see a life grow that was half his fire and half her steel. It was a dream he had murdered long ago. He turned slowly to face her. He did not touch her. He did not embrace her. But the wall behind his eyes had cracked. He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. You are offering your life, he said. I am offering my soul. Lydia corrected him. Because that is what he wants to buy, and I would rather give it to you for free. Taza looked at her for a long eternity. The desert wind howled softly around the eaves of the house, a lonely sound that suddenly felt a little less solitary. He saw the tremble in her hands, but he also saw the iron in her spine. Go to sleep, Lydia, Taza said finally. His voice was soft, devoid of the anger from before. We will talk about this when the sun is up, but know this. He paused, his gaze dropping to her stomach, then back to her eyes. If you ever carry my child, he said, the words falling like stones into deep water, you will never be free of me, not in this life or the next. Apache blood does not let go. Lydia swallowed hard, but she nodded. I know. Taza watched her turn and walk back into the house. He stayed on the porch, alone in the dark. He touched his chest, where his heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm. He had told her a child was not a bargain, but as he looked out at the shadowed outline of the mountains, he realized that for the first time in years, he was afraid. Not of Crowley, not of the railroad. He was afraid because he wanted to say yes. The morning after the vow, the sun rose over the ranch with a blinding intensity, but the atmosphere within the homestead had shifted. The silence between Lydia and Taza was no longer a void of indifference. It was charged, thick with the weight of words spoken and the unspoken promise hanging in the air like dust motes. Taza did not mention her offer. He did not speak of children, or legacies, or souls. But when he found her struggling with the heavy water buckets at dawn, he did not walk past. He stopped, took the buckets from her blistered hands without a word, and carried them to the trough himself. If you are going to stay, he said, his back to her as he poured the water, you need to know how to survive, not just clean. From that day forward, the nature of her education changed. It was no longer a test of her endurance, but a preparation for war. In the afternoons, when the heat was at its peak, Taza took her out to the flatlands behind the corral. He handed her a Winchester rifle, the wood smooth and heavy in her hands. Hold it tight against your shoulder, he instructed, his voice low and devoid of its usual harshness. If you leave a gap, the kick will bruise you. Breathe out before you squeeze. Do not pull. Squeeze! Lydia fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, making her stumble. But she gritted her teeth and leveled the weapon again. Taza watched her, his arms crossed. He corrected her stance not with mockery, but with a firm, impersonal touch, a hand on her elbow to lift it, a nudge to her boot to widen her stance. Again, he said. He taught her to read the land. He showed her how a bent twig could tell the story of a passing deer or a lurking man. He taught her which cacti held water and which snakes would kill her before she could draw a breath. He taught her to ride not like a lady in a park, but like a fugitive low over the neck of the horse, trusting the animal's instincts as much as her own. Lydia absorbed it all with a desperate hunger. She woke before the sun, her muscles aching, and worked until her hands were raw. She learned to muck out the stalls without gagging. She learned to rope a fence post from 10 yards. She shed the last vestiges of the Boston debutante, her skin darkening to a golden brown, her hair often loose and wind-blown, but the internal battle was harder to win. At night, lying on her cot in the small room off the kitchen, Lydia stared at the rough ceiling beams. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a chorus of Victorian morality. A lady is a vessel of virtue. A woman's worth is her purity. She was a virgin, technically, but in her heart, she had already given herself away. She had offered her body to a man not out of duty to a husband, but out of a wild, terrifying desire for freedom. Was she a fallen woman? The town certainly thought so. When she rode into Dustwater with Taza to collect mail or trade hides, the reaction was visceral. Women she had never met pulled their skirts aside as she passed. Men watched her with a mixture of lust and contempt. "There goes the squaw man's comfort," a woman whispered loud enough for Lydia to hear outside the church. "Giving up her soul for a roof over her head. Shameful." Lydia kept her head high, but the words stung like a lash. She saw the pity in the eyes of the baker's wife, the way the woman pressed a stale loaf of bread into Lydia's hands without asking for payment, as if feeding a stray dog. "Poor thing," the eyes said, "lost to civilization." Taza saw it too. He rode beside her, his face a mask of stone, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. He did not defend her with words he knew that would only make it worse, but he placed his body between her and the town, a silent barrier against their judgment. The tension broke, inevitably, with the arrival of Sheriff Briggs. He rode up to the ranch one evening as Lydia was helping No-Kai repair a saddle on the porch. The sheriff did not dismount. He sat on his horse, chewing on a toothpick, his eyes scanning the property with a proprietary air. "Just checking on things," Briggs said, his voice oily. "Making sure everything is peaceful." Taza emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He did not look up, but his shoulders were tense. "It is peaceful when you are not here, Briggs." Briggs chuckled. "You always did have a sharp tongue. Taza, pity it will not stop a train." He turned his gaze to Lydia. "Mr. Crowley is getting impatient. Miss Hart, he says the water rights need to be settled before the track laying begins next month. He says it would be a shame if..." Complications arose. "The only complication is a thief trying to steal what is not his," Taza said, stepping onto the porch. "Is that so?" Briggs leaned forward in his saddle. "Crowley thinks the complication is a certain runaway who is confusing matters. He thinks maybe you are keeping her against her will. That would be a hanging offense. Taza, even for a war hero." "She is free to go," Taza said flatly. Lydia stood up, her heart pounding. "I am staying," she said, her voice clear. "Tell Mr. Crowley I am exactly where I choose to be." Briggs's eyes narrowed. He looked from Taza to Lydia, a sneer curling his lip. "Well, isn't that sweet? Just remember, Taza, water dries up, wood burns, and pretty little things like this." He gestured to Lydia. "They break easy in the rough." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, the threat hanging heavy in the dust he left behind. 3 days later, the sky turned a bruised purple in the west. "Sandstorm," No-Kai said, sniffing the air. "A big one." The wind hit them an hour later. a wall of screaming fury that scoured the paint from the wood and turned the sky into a choking brown haze. The cattle, sensing the danger, panicked. They broke through the south fence, scattering into the blinding dust. "We have to turn them back!" Taza shouted over the roar of the wind. He was already mounting his horse, wrapping a scarf around his face. Lydia did not hesitate. She grabbed her own scarf and mounted the mare Taza had given her. "Stay inside!" Taza yelled at her, seeing her struggle with the reins as the wind battered them. "They are my livelihood too," Lydia shouted back. She kicked the mare forward before he could stop her. The next hour was a chaotic nightmare. Visibility was 0. The sand stung like thousands of needles. Lydia rode blindly, guided only by the shouts of Taza and Nokai and the terrified bellowing of the steers. She found a group of stragglers near the dry creek bed and drove them back, waving her hat and screaming until her throat was raw. But as she turned to find the others, her mare stepped into a gopher hole. The horse stumbled violently, pitching Lydia forward. She hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of her. She lay there, gasping, the sand filling her nose and mouth. Through the haze, she heard the thunder of hooves. A dozen panicked steers were stampeding straight toward her. She tried to scramble up, but her ankle flared with pain. She curled into a ball, covering her head, waiting for the crushing weight of the hooves. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over her. A horse slammed into the flank of the led steer, forcing it aside. An arm hooked around Lydia's waist, dragging her up from the dirt with bruising strength. She was hauled onto the back of Taza's horse. He held her tight against his chest, one arm controlling the terrified animal, the other shielding her face from the sand. "Hold on!" he roared. He rode them out of the path of the stampede, finding shelter in the lee of a rocky outcrop. They huddled there as the storm raged around them, the horse shivering beneath them. Lydia was pressed against him, her face buried in his buckskin shirt. She could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, a frantic rhythm that matched her own. "You foolish woman," Taza growled, his voice rough near her ear. "I told you to stay inside." Lydia pulled back slightly to look at him. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes wild with fear, not for himself, but for her. "I am not a guest," she shouted over the wind. "I am part of this ranch." Taza looked at her, and for a moment, the anger vanished. He brushed the sand from her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. He did not speak, but he pulled her closer, wrapping his coat around her shoulders to shield her from the biting sand. They rode back to the house in the dying light of the storm. The roof of the barn had lost some shingles, and the corral fence was down in 3 places, but the house stood firm. That night, the wind still howled outside, shaking the timber walls. Taza and Nokai sat by the fire, drinking coffee laced with whiskey. Lydia sat nearby, wrapping a bandage around her twisted ankle. "The roof needs patching," Taza said, staring into the flames. "Before the rains come next month, Crowley will come before the rains," Nokai said quietly. Taza looked at his friend. "I know." "He will use her." Nokai nodded toward Lydia. "He will say you kidnapped her. He will bring the cavalry." Taza set his cup down with a clatter. "So what do I do? Nokai, throw her out. Let her walk into the desert alone. Crowley will pick her up before she gets 5 miles. "You are afraid," Nokai said. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact. "Yes," Taza admitted. "I am afraid that keeping her here is a death sentence. For the ranch. And sending her away." Taza looked at Lydia. She was focused on her ankle, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked tired, battered, and utterly beautiful in the firelight. "Sending her away would kill me," Taza whispered, so low Lydia could not hear. Nokai smiled, a rare expression that crinkled his eyes. "This land never chose a coward. Taza, it breaks the weak. She is not weak. She chose you. The question is, do you have the courage to choose her back to fight for her, not just for the dirt?" Taza did not answer. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The storm had passed, but a new danger was rising. He had seen it earlier, when he was riding the fence line. A section of the barbed wire had been cut cleanly. with wire cutters. It was not the wind. It was a message. And tonight, faint in the wind, he could hear the distant echo of a gunshot. Not a hunter's shot, a warning shot. Crowley was testing the perimeter. He was probing for weakness. Lydia finished binding her ankle and looked up. She saw Taza standing by the window, his silhouette rigid against the moonlight. He looked like a statue carved from the canyon rock, solitary and enduring. She stood up, testing her weight on her injured foot. It was held. She walked slowly to him. "Taza," she said softly. He turned. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, the scar on his cheek, the depth of his dark eyes. "They are out there," he said, "watching." "Let them watch," Lydia said. She reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. "I am not going anywhere." Taza looked down at their joined hands, a white hand and a brown hand, against the backdrop of a war that wanted to destroy them both. "They will call you mad," he said, "staying with an Apache while a millionaire waits for you." "I told you," Lydia whispered, looking up into his eyes. "I will carry your child, even if the whole world calls me mad, even if they burn this house down around us." Taza squeezed her hand. It was not a romantic gesture. Not yet. It was an anchor, a pact. "Then let us make sure they burn for it too," he said. Outside, the wind died down, leaving the desert silent under the watchful eyes of the stars. But it was the silence before the ambush. The first shot had been fired in the dark, and the war for the soul of the canyon and for the hearts of the two people standing in it had truly begun. Silas Crowley arrived in Dustwater not like a man, but like an inevitable event. He came in a private coach flanked by 4 riders whose dusters concealed sawed-off shotguns. The town, usually loud with the clamor of miners and drovers, fell into a hushed, terrified reverence. He wore a suit of charcoal wool that defied the heat, a silk vest the color of dried blood, and a pocket watch that ticked away the remaining time of anyone who stood in his path. He set up his command post in the finest room of the hotel, a space that still smelled of sawdust and whiskey, and summoned Sheriff Briggs. Briggs entered the room with his hat in his hand, a layer of sweat glistening on his upper lip. Crowley did not ask him to sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the shimmering horizon where the rail lines would soon carve through the earth. "I am told," Crowley said, his voice smooth and devoid of inflection, "that my property is currently residing in a shack on the edge of the desert." "She is at the Apache ranch, Mr. Crowley," Briggs stammered. "With Taza, I tried to talk sense into her, but she is stubborn." Crowley turned. His face was handsome in a way that suggested a statue rather than flesh cold, hard, and unyielding. "I do not pay you to talk sense. Sheriff, I pay you to maintain order. A white woman living with a savage disorder. It is an affront to decency, and it is a theft of my assets." "Taza is dangerous," Briggs said defensively. "He was a scout. He shoots like a demon." "Then do not give him a chance to shoot," Crowley said. He walked to the table and poured himself a glass of water, inspecting the clarity of the liquid before taking a sip. "Go out there. Remind her of her duty. Bring her back. Do it quietly. I want her returned to me before the surveyors arrive tomorrow. I will not have my personal affairs become fodder for the newspapers. And if Taza resists," Crowley set the glass down, "then you are the law, are you not? Defend yourself." The sun was high and merciless when Briggs returned to the ranch. This time, he brought 6 men. They did not ride with the casual slouch of cowhands, but with the stiff, alert posture of hired guns. They stopped at the edge of the yard, their hands hovering near their holsters. Taza was in the corral, breaking a young paint horse. When the riders appeared, he did not scramble for his rifle. He simply calmed the horse, stroking its neck, and walked leisurely to the fence. He vaulted over the rails and stood in the dust, his arms loose at his sides. Lydia was on the porch, churning butter, her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked down the steps. She did not stop until she stood shoulder to shoulder with Taza, Briggs looked down from his horse, his eyes flicking between the two of them. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Afternoon," Briggs said. "We are here for the lady. Mr. Crowley is in town. He is ready to receive her." "I am not a package to be delivered," Lydia said. Her voice shook slightly, but her chin was lifted. "Now, Miss Hart," Briggs said, his tone dripping with false solicitude. "You have had your little adventure. You have played house in the dirt. But the game is over. Your betrothed is a patient man. But even he has limits. Get your things." Taza shifted his weight. It was a subtle movement, but the men behind Briggs tensed. "She stays where she wants to stay." "I am not talking to you, half-breed," Briggs snapped. He looked back at Lydia. "If you do not come with us, we will have to assume you are being held against your will. That gives us the right to use force to liberate you." It was a trap. Lydia saw it clearly. If Taza raised a hand to stop them, they would gun him down and claim they were rescuing a captive white woman. The law would pin a medal on Briggs's chest. Lydia took a step forward, placing herself between Taza and the guns. "I am here because I choose to be," she declared. Her voice rang out across the yard, clear and defiant. "I am not a captive. I am not a victim. I left Silas Crowley because he is a monster, and I came here because this is the only place I have found honor." The silence that followed was absolute. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, uncomfortable with the directness of the accusation. Briggs's face turned a mottled red. "You are shaming yourself, girl. Standing there defending a savage." "He is more of a man than you will ever be," Lydia said. "Now get off this land, unless you have a warrant signed by a judge. You are trespassing." Briggs's hand twitched toward his revolver. Taza's eyes locked onto the movement, his own hand drifting inches from his Colt. For a second, violence hung in the air like the static before a lightning strike. Then Briggs laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He pulled his hand away from his gun. "Fine," Briggs said. "Have it your way. But look around you, girl. Look at this dirt. Look at this nothing. The railroad is coming right through here. Whether you are in that house or not, the iron is coming. And when it does, it crushes everything in its path." He wheeled his horse around. "Let us go. Boys, let them enjoy their dust a little longer." As they rode away, the tension drained out of Lydia, leaving her knees weak. She swayed, and Taza's hand shot out to steady her. His grip was firm on her arm. "You should not have stepped in front of me," Taza said quietly. "They could have shot you." Lydia looked up at him. "And you would have let them shoot you to save me. I think we are even." Taza looked at her for a long moment, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was the first time she had seen him look at her with something other than wariness or concern. It was a look of respect. "Crowley will not stop," Taza said. "Briggs was just the messenger. They will come back, and next time, they will not talk." "I know," Lydia said. "We need to move the herd," Taza said, his gaze shifting to the horizon where dark clouds were beginning to gather, a rare sight in the territory. "If they cannot get you, they will hurt the animals to draw me out. We will take the horses up to the Red Canyon. There is a box canyon there where they will be safe." The ride to the Red Canyon took 3 hours. The sky, which had been a brilliant, blinding blue for weeks, began to curdle into heavy gray bruises. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of ozone and wet sage. They drove the herd of 30 horses up the narrow, winding trail. The canyon walls rose around them like the ribs of the earth, towering and red. By the time they reached the box canyon, a natural corral with high walls and plenty of grass, the first fat drops of rain were hitting the dust. "We have to find cover," Taza shouted over the rising wind. "When the rain comes here, it brings the mountain down with it." They secured the horses and scrambled up a scree slope to a shallow cave Taza knew, a jagged mouth in the canyon wall. They made it inside just as the heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge. Water poured from the sky in sheets, turning the dry wash below them into a raging torrent of brown mud and debris. Within minutes, the temperature plummeted. They were trapped. Taza built a small fire near the mouth of the cave using dried scrub brush he had stored there on previous trips. The flames flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Outside, the world was a roar of water and thunder. Inside, it was intimate, quiet, and small. Lydia sat on a saddle blanket, shivering slightly in her damp dress. Taza sat opposite her, feeding the fire. The space was so small that their knees almost touched. "I have never seen rain like this," Lydia whispered. "The desert saves it all up," Taza said. "It stays thirsty for a year, and then it drinks too much, too fast. It is a violent land." Lydia watched the firelight play across his face. He had taken off his hat, and his dark hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked younger in the dim light, less like a warrior and more like a man. "This is the first time," Lydia said, her voice barely audible over the rain. Taza looked up. "The first time for what? That I have been alone with a man," she said. "At night, like this." Taza went still. He held a twig in his hand, suspended over the fire. "You should be afraid." "I am not," Lydia said. She surprised herself with the truth of it. "I was afraid in Boston. I was afraid of the carriage. I was afraid when Briggs looked at me. But I am not afraid of you." "You do not know me," Taza said. "I have killed men. Lydia, I have taken scalps when I was young and full of hate. I have done things your God would send me to hell for. And I was prepared to sell myself to a man I loathed to pay my father's debts." Lydia countered. "We do what we must to survive." She shifted, moving slightly closer to the fire, and to him. The warmth radiated between them. "I told you I would carry your child," Lydia said. The words hung in the air, heavier than the thunder outside. "I did not say it to shock you, and I did not say it just to secure a roof over my head." Taza looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Why did you say that?" "Because I am done letting other men decide what happens to my body," Lydia said fiercely. "My father decided who I would marry. Crowley decided I was his property. Briggs decided I was a whore. I wanted to make a choice that was mine alone. Irrevocable." Taza reached out. For a moment, she thought he would pull away, but instead, his hand brushed her cheek. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of rope and rain, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He traced the line of her jaw. "In my culture," Taza said, his voice a low rumble in his chest, "we do not speak of children lightly. A child is not just flesh, it is spirit." He leaned in closer. The smell of rain and smoke and male skin filled Lydia's senses. "When a woman gives a man a child," Taza explained, "she is not just giving him an heir, she is braiding her spirit with his. She is saying that her ancestors and his ancestors will walk together. It is a transfer of the soul." Lydia's breath hitched. "My soul is already here, Taza. It has been here since the moment I stepped off that stagecoach." Taza looked at her mouth. The desire in his eyes was naked now, stripped of the defenses he had worn for so long. "If I kiss you," he warned, "there is no going back. You are marked." "Mark me," Lydia whispered. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was not the rough, demanding kiss she had feared from Crowley. It was slow. It was a question and an answer all at once. Taza's lips were warm, tasting of the rain. He kissed her with a restraint that spoke of a terrible, leashed power. Lydia melted into him, her hands coming up to grip the front of his buckskin shirt. She felt the hard muscle beneath the leather, the steady, heavy beat of his heart. For a virgin. She felt no hesitation, only a profound sense of homecoming. She opened her mouth to him, and the kiss deepened, becoming a desperate seal against the cold world outside. They clung to each other as the storm raged, two outcasts finding a center in the chaos. They did not go further. Taza pulled back eventually, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. He kept his hands on her face, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile that he had been entrusted with. "If you carry my child one day, Lydia Hart," Taza whispered, the words vibrating against her skin, "then I will carry your soul with mine, for as long as this land remembers my name." Lydia closed her eyes, tears slipping out from under her lashes. It was a proposal more profound than any ring or contract. It was an offering of his entire being. "I accept," she whispered back. The dawn brought a sky scrubbed clean, a blue so piercing it hurt the eyes. The floodwaters had receded, leaving the canyon floor coated in a thick layer of red mud. They rode back to the ranch in silence. But it was a comfortable silence. They rode knee to knee. Taza no longer looked ahead constantly. He kept glancing at her, checking her, ensuring she was there. Lydia sat taller in the saddle. She was no longer the runaway girl. She was the woman of the ranch. She belonged to the land, and the land belonged to her. But as they crested the final ridge that overlooked the valley, the feeling of peace shattered. Smoke was rising from the valley floor. Not the cozy smoke of a chimney, but the thick, black smoke of destruction. "No," Taza breathed. He spurred his horse, and Lydia followed, fear clutching her throat. They galloped down the slope, mud flying from the hooves. When they reached the yard, the devastation was calculated and precise. The house still stood. Crowley was too smart to burn a structure that might contain the woman he wanted, but the winter hay barn was a smoldering ruin. A year's worth of feed for the cattle was gone, turned to black ash. The fences near the house had been cut, the wire coiled and mangled beyond repair. But it was the silence that was most terrifying. The cattle were gone, scattered or driven off. Taza dismounted while his horse was still moving. He ran to the water trough. He dipped his hand in and brought it to his nose. He recoils, wiping his hand on his pants. "What is it?" Lydia asked, sliding from her saddle. "Oil," Taza said, his voice dead. "They dumped crude oil and carcasses into the well. The water is poisoned." Lydia stared at the slick sheen on the water. In the desert, water was life. To poison a well was not just an act of war. It was an act of extermination. It was a statement that Crowley did not just want them gone. He wanted the land to die rather than belong to them. Taza turned to look at the burning remains of the hay. His face was terrible to behold. The softness from the cave was gone, replaced by the hard, merciless mask of the Apache warrior. But beneath the rage, Lydia saw the fear. He walked over to her and took her shoulders. His grip was bruising. "He is not playing anymore," Taza said. "He is not waiting for the law. He wants to starve us out. He wants us thirsty and weak." "We can clean the well," Lydia said, though her voice trembled. "We can haul water from the canyon." "It is not about the water," Taza said. He looked deep into her eyes, the memory of their vow in the cave colliding with the brutal reality of the morning. He burned the food. He poisoned the drink. But he left the house standing. "Why? Because he expects you to be in it," Taza said grimly. "They are not just coming for my land anymore. Lydia, they are coming for you." He released her and turned to look at the horizon, where the dust of Crowley's riders was likely still settling. "Go inside," Taza commanded, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "Load every gun we have. The war is here." Silas Crowley stood on the balcony of the hotel in Dustwater, watching the sun bleed out into the western horizon. Below him, 12 men sat on restless horses. They were not the rough, unwashed cowboys who drifted through town looking for a day wage. These were professionals, men with cold eyes and expensive repeating rifles, recruited from the private security forces of the railroad. Sheriff Briggs sat among them, looking pale and sweating despite the cooling evening air. Crowley leaned over the railing, his voice calm, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Tonight, we are going to correct an error in the survey maps," Crowley said. He lit a cigar, the match flaring briefly against the darkening sky. "You are to write out the Apache claim. You will check the boundaries. If a fire should break out, well, the desert is a dry and dangerous place. Accidents happen." He paused, letting the smoke drift from his lips. "The man, Taza, is an obstacle to progress. Remove him. As for the woman, Miss Hart, she is confused. She has been misled by a savage. Bring her back to me, unharmed, if possible. But if she clings to the burning wreckage, bring her back anyway. Briggs nodded nervously. And if the cavalry asks questions, I own the cavalry. Sheriff, Crowley said dismissively. Ride. At the ranch, the silence was heavy, broken only by the wind rattling the dry sagebrush. Taza stood on the porch, cleaning his Winchester for the third time. He did not need to see the riders to know they were coming. He could feel it in the earth, a vibration of intent that predated the sound of hooves. Nokai materialized from the darkness near the barn, leading his horse. He had ridden hard from the ridge where he had met the Apache messenger. They are coming, Nokai said, his voice grim. 12 guns, maybe more. Briggs is with them, but he is not leading. These are railroad men. Taza nodded slowly. He reassembled the rifle, the metal clicking softly into place. He turned to look at the door of the house, where Lydia stood. She was wearing a pair of his old trousers, belted at the waist, and a heavy shirt. Her hair was braided back, tight against her skull. She looked nothing like the girl on the stagecoach. She looked like a woman preparing for a funeral, or a war. We cannot hold the house, Taza said. It is wood and dry pitch. They will burn it first to flush us out. Where do we go? Lydia asked. Her voice was steady, though her hands were clenched at her sides. The rocks behind the well, Taza said. There is a fissure there. It gives cover from 3 sides. He walked over to her and pressed the heavy rifle into her hands. Take this. Lydia took the weapon. It felt cold and alien, yet strangely reassuring. What about you? Nokai and I will be in the dark, Taza said. We will make them pay for every yard of ground. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into her muscle. Listen to me, Lydia. They will come with fire. They will shout your name. They will try to make you panic. I will not panic, she said. If they get close, Taza continued, ignoring her brave words. If they cross the line of the trough, you do not shoot to scare them. You do not shoot the ground. You aim for the chest. You shoot to live. Lydia looked into his eyes. In them, she saw the terrifying reality of what he was asking. He was not asking her to be a spectator. He was asking her to become a killer. To cross a line that her society said a woman could never cross without losing her soul. But she had already promised her soul to him. I will shoot to live, she repeated. Taza leaned his forehead against hers for one brief, desperate second. It was a goodbye without the word. Then he pulled away and vanished into the shadows with Nokai. The attack began not with a gunshot, but with a torch. A rider galloped past the outer fence at a dead run, throwing a flaming brand onto the roof of the supply shed. The dry wood, seasoned by years of relentless sun, caught instantly. A roar of orange flame leaped into the night sky, illuminating the ranch yard with a flickering, hellish light. Gunfire erupted from the darkness beyond the fence line. Bullets chewed into the dirt and splintered the wood of the porch railing. The air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of black powder and burning pine. Lydia crouched in the crevice of the rocks, 50 yards behind the house. The heat of the fire warmed her face, even from this distance. She pressed the stock of the rifle against her shoulder, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw a shadow move near the corral. A man, silhouetted against the firelight, was cutting the wire. Crack! A shot rang out from the darkness to her left, Taza's position. The man at the fence crumpled, clutching his leg. They are in the brush, a voice screamed from the gloom. Spread out, flank them. The attackers dismounted. Using their horses as cover, they poured fire into the shadows, a relentless hail of lead. Taza and Nokia were moving constantly, firing and relocating. Lydia could see the muzzle flashes of their rifles appearing in different spots behind the water trough, near the woodpile, from the corner of the burning shed. They were fighting like ghosts, using the confusion to their advantage, but there were too many of them. Lydia watched as 3 men broke away from the main group, circling wide through the scrub brush to come up behind the house. They were heading toward the rise where Taza was currently pinned down. They were going to trap him. Lydia shifted her aim. Her breath caught in her throat. She aligned the iron sights on the lead man. He was just a shape, a dark figure in a duster. But he was a human being. A man with a mother. A man with a name. Shoot to live. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard, slamming into her shoulder. The sound was deafening. Down in the brush, the lead man spun around, dropping his gun, and fell to his knees. "Sniper!" one of the other flankers yelled, diving for cover. "Up in the rocks." Lydia worked the lever of the rifle, ejecting the spent shell. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was strangely clear. She had done it. She had drawn blood. The horror of it was there, cold in her stomach, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, protective fury. They were trying to kill Taza. They were trying to take her home. She fired again, the bullet kicking up dirt near the second man's head. He scrambled back, abandoning his advance. "Hold fire!" A voice boomed over the chaos. It was a voice Lydia knew, a voice that had haunted her nightmares for months. Silas Crowley rode into the circle of firelight. He sat atop a magnificent white stallion that looked like a ghost in the smoke. He was unarmed, or at least he held no weapon in his hands. He rode with an arrogance that defied the flying bullets, trusting in his money and his name to be a shield stronger than steel. "Taza!" Crowley shouted. "The game is finished. Your shed is gone. Your barn will be next. Do you want to die in the ashes of failure?" The shooting tapered off. Taza did not answer. Crowley turned his horse toward the rocks, shielding his eyes against the glare of the fire. "Lydia, I know you are there. I know you are watching." Lydia lowered the rifle slightly, her heart pounding in her ears. "Come out, my dear," Crowley called, his voice taking on that smooth, persuasive tone he used in boardrooms. "This has gone far enough. You have had your rebellion. You have made your point. But look around you. This is death. This is squalor. Come down now, and we will forget this ever happened. I will restore your reputation. I will save your family. You will be Mrs. Silas Crowley, the queen of this territory." Lydia looked at the burning shed. She looked at the dark shapes of the hired killers surrounding them. She looked at Taza's position, where he lay silent, outnumbered and outgunned. If she stayed hidden, they would storm the rocks. They would kill Taza to get to her. She stood up. "Lydia, no!" Taza's voice ripped from the shadows, ragged with fear. Lydia stepped out from the fissure. The firelight caught her figure, casting a long shadow across the red dust. She held the rifle in one hand, barrel pointed at the ground. But she did not look defeated. She looked furious. "I am here, Silas," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the sudden silence. Crowley smiled, a triumphant, predatory expression. "There she is, a little dusty, a little wild, but we can polish that away." He urged his horse forward, riding toward her. "Put down the gun. Lydia, it does not suit you." Lydia watched him come. He looked so out of place here, with his silk vest and his polished boots. He looked like a disease that had infected the desert. "You promised my father you would take care of me," Lydia said, walking slowly down the slope to meet him. "And I will," Crowley said, stopping his horse 10 feet from her. He reached down a hand. "Take my hand. Leave this filth behind." Lydia stopped. She looked at his hand, soft, manicured, the hand of a man who signed death warrants but never pulled a trigger. Then she looked at his face. "You burned the food," she said. "You poisoned the water." "Necessary measures." Crowley shrugged. "Business." "This is not business," Lydia said. She raised the rifle, leveling it at his chest. "This is my home." Crowley's smile vanished. "Do not be stupid, girl. You will not shoot me. You do not have it in you." He kicked his horse forward, lunging to grab the barrel of the rifle. He was fast, faster than she expected. His hand closed around the metal. Lydia did not pull the trigger. He had pushed the barrel aside, but she swung the heavy wooden stock with all her strength. It connected with his jaw with a sickening crack. Crowley roared in pain and rage, reeling back in his saddle. Blood poured from his mouth. "You bitch!" He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a derringer, a small, deadly pistol. He pointed it straight at her face. His eyes were wild, stripped of their veneer of civilization. "If I cannot own you," he screamed, "no one will." The gunshot was deafening. But it did not hit Lydia. A blur of buckskin and motion slammed into her from the side, knocking her to the ground. Taza had sprinted from his cover, crossing the open ground in a suicide run. He took the bullet meant for her. He grunted a sharp, wet sound and collapsed on top of her. "Taza!" Lydia screamed. She scrambled out from under him. He rolled onto his back, clutching his side. Blood, dark and slick, was already soaking through his shirt, spreading between his fingers. Crowley was struggling to control his panicked horse, wiping blood from his shattered jaw. He aimed the pistol again, this time at the prone Taza. "Die, you mongrel!" Crowley spat. Taza looked up. His face was gray, his eyes losing focus. He reached out with a trembling hand and gripped Lydia's wrist. His grip was weak, fading, but his eyes were locked on hers with a terrible intensity. "Lydia," he rasped, "take the land, take the herd, take everything that is mine." He coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. "My soul," he whispered, the words barely a breath. "It is yours already." Something broke inside Lydia. The fear vanished. The hesitation vanished. The Victorian girl who worried about embroidery and etiquette died in the dust beside the man she loved. She snatched the Winchester from where it had fallen. She did not stand up. She stayed on her knees, in the blood and the dirt. She worked the lever, chambering around. Crowley saw the look in her eyes and tried to wheel his horse around. "Wait!" Lydia pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Crowley in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped the pistol and fell from his horse, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He screamed, thrashing in the dirt, clutching his shattered shoulder. "Kill them!" Briggs shouted from the perimeter. "Kill them both!" The hired guns raised their weapons. Lydia threw herself over Taza's body, shielding him with her own, waiting for the end. But the volley never came. From the darkness behind the gunman, a war cry erupted, a terrifying, ululating sound that chilled the blood. Nokai had not been idle. While Taza drew their fire, he had signaled. 5 Apache riders burst from the canyon shadows, their horses painted for war. They did not have repeating rifles, but they had the element of surprise and a ferocity that the hired guns could not match. They descended on the railroad men like a storm. Gunfire crackled, chaotic and close. Horses screamed. Briggs, seeing the tide turn, did not fire a shot. He spurred his horse and fled into the night, abandoning his employer. The remaining gunmen, realizing they were fighting Apaches in the dark for a man who was already down, broke and ran. Within minutes, the yard was silent again, save for the crackling of the fire and the groans of the wounded. Lydia did not look at the battle. She did not look at Crowley, who was whimpering in the dust a few yards away. She looked only at Taza. She tore the hem of her skirt, her hands shaking uncontrollably now. She pressed the cloth against the wound in his side. "Taza," she begged, her tears falling onto his face. "Stay with me. You promised. You said Apache blood does not let go." Taza blinked, his eyes focusing slowly on her face. He winced as she applied pressure. "Crowley," he wheezed. "He is down," Lydia said. "I shot him." A faint, pained smile touched Taza's lips. "Good shot." Nokai appeared beside them, his face smeared with soot. He knelt down, examining the wound with quick, efficient hands. He looked at Lydia, his expression grave but not hopeless. "The bullet went through," Nokai said. "It missed the lung, but he has lost a lot of blood." "We need to get him inside," Lydia said, her voice hard with command. "Nokai, help me lift him. Get the boiling water. Get the needle." "Is the house safe?" Nokai asked, glancing at the smoldering shed. "The house is ours," Lydia said fiercely. "And no one is taking him out of it." They lifted him. Taza groaned, his head lolling back, but he kept his eyes on Lydia. As they carried him up the steps of the porch, past the writhing form of Silas Crowley, Lydia did not look down at her former betrothed. Crowley reached out a bloody hand, clutching at the hem of her skirt. "Lydia, help me." Lydia stopped. She looked down at him. There was no hate in her eyes anymore, only a cold, distant pity. She pulled her skirt free from his grasp. "The sheriff will come for you in the morning. Silas," she said. "If you live—" She turned and carried Taza into the house, kicking the door shut behind her against the night, the fire, and the world that had tried to destroy them. The smell of the room was a pungent mixture of willow bark, carbolic acid, and the lingering, acrid scent of wood smoke that seemed to have soaked into the very timbers of the house. For 3 days, the world had shrunk down to the 4 walls of Taza's bedroom. Lydia Hart sat in a wooden chair beside the bed, her head resting on the mattress near Taza's hand. She had not washed her hair since the night of the fire. Her dress, the rough work clothes she had worn into battle, was stiff with dried mud and blood, some of it hers, most of it his. She refused to change. She refused to leave. On the bed, Taza lay still, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, rhythmic cadence. The bandage around his ribs was stark white against his bronze skin, a stark contrast to the dark bruising that spread across his torso. The bullet had passed through, missing the lung by a fraction of an inch, but the loss of blood had been severe. For the first 2 nights, the fever had raged like a wildfire, making him thrash and mutter in Apache, calling out names of the dead. Lydia had held him down. She and Nokai had taken turns sponging his forehead with cool water from the cistern, forcing willow tea between his cracked lips. "He is strong," Nokai said from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, looking exhausted but alert. "The fever broke an hour ago. He is in true sleep now." Lydia lifted her head, her eyes rimmed with red shadows. She looked at Taza's face, which had finally lost the gray pallor of death. "He has to live. Nokai, he promised me." "He keeps his promises," Nokai said simply. "Even the foolish ones." Nokai stepped into the room, holding a fresh basin of water. "You should sleep. Lydia, if he wakes up and sees you looking like a ghost, he will think he died and went to the wrong place." Lydia managed a weak, fractured smile. "I will sleep when he opens his eyes and tells me my name." The silence that followed was not heavy, but companionable. Outside, the sounds of the ranch were different now. There was the sound of hammering Nokai, and 2 other Apache men who had stayed behind were repairing the corral fence. There was the sound of wind, no longer carrying the roar of flames. Later that afternoon, the sound of carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive shattered the peace. Lydia stiffened, her hand instinctively going to the heavy Colt revolver she now kept on the bedside table. Nokai looked out the window. "It is Dr. Miller, and a soldier." Lydia stood up, her legs trembling from fatigue. She smoothed her skirt, though it was a hopeless task, and walked out onto the porch. Dr. Miller was a gruff, portly man with a bushy white mustache, carrying a leather bag. Beside him stood a lieutenant from the cavalry outpost, looking young and uncomfortable. "Miss Hart," the doctor said, tipping his hat. "We heard there was a patient." "He is resting," Lydia said, blocking the door with her body. "You can see him. Doctor, the army stays outside." The lieutenant flushed. "Ma'am, I am here to make a statement regarding the incident with Mr. Crowley." "The incident," Lydia repeated, her voice cold. "You mean the attempted murder? We are investigating the disturbance," the lieutenant corrected, shifting his weight. "Mr. Crowley has been detained. He was brought into town 3 days ago with a gunshot wound to the shoulder. He claims he was ambushed." Lydia laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Ambushed? He rode onto this land with 12 hired guns and a torch. Look at the ashes. Lieutenant, look at the dead horses. If that is an ambush, then General Custer died of old age." The doctor cleared his throat. "The town is talking. Miss Hart, people saw Briggs come back with his tail between his legs. They saw Crowley's men run, and they saw the condition of this place. The story has changed. Folks do not take kindly to a man burning down a homestead, Apache or not, especially when there is a white woman involved." Lydia looked at the lieutenant. "Silas Crowley tried to kill Taza. He tried to kidnap me. If you want a statement, write this down. I shot him. And if he ever sets foot on this land again, I will aim higher." The lieutenant blinked, clearly unprepared for the ferocity of the woman standing before him. "I see. Well, the territorial magistrate is due in Dustwater tomorrow. He will want to speak with Taza. When Taza can stand, he will speak," Lydia said. "Until then, this is private property." She stepped aside to let the doctor pass, then closed the door in the lieutenant's face. The news from Dustwater trickled in over the next few days, carried by Nokia and the few brave souls who ventured out to the ranch to offer help. The tide had turned. Fear, Lydia realized, was a fragile currency. Silas Crowley had spent years buying the town's obedience with the threat of his power, but the moment he was seen bleeding in the dirt, defeated by a woman and a rancher, the illusion shattered. Crowley was under house arrest in the hotel, guarded by territorial marshals who had finally arrived to investigate the corruption Briggs had allowed to fester. The evidence was overwhelming: forged land deeds, bribed officials, and the testimony of the hired guns who, facing the gallows, were eager to trade their silence for leniency. Sheriff Briggs had not waited for the marshals. He had stripped off his badge and vanished into the night, riding south toward the Mexican border, leaving behind a legacy of shame. But for Lydia, the victory felt distant. Her battle was fought in the quiet hours of the night, listening to Taza breathe. On the 5th day, Taza opened his eyes. Lydia was dozing in the chair when she felt a hand touch her hair. She jerked awake, her heart pounding. Taza was watching her. His eyes were clear, dark pools that reflected the morning light streaming through the window. He looked weak, but the fire was back in his gaze. "You look terrible," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Lydia let out a sob that was half laugh. She grabbed his hand, pressing it against her cheek. "You are one to talk. You have a hole in you." "I remember," Taza said softly. He shifted, wincing as the pain caught him. "Crowley, in custody," Lydia said. "I shot his shoulder. He will live, unfortunately, but he will not trouble us again." Taza squeezed her hand. His grip was weak, but steady. "You stayed." "I told you," Lydia whispered. "I'm not a guest." Taza closed his eyes, a look of profound peace settling over his sharp features. "Water." Lydia brought the cup to his lips, supporting his head. As he drank, she felt the last of the fear drain out of her, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. He was alive. The gamble had paid off. A week later, Taza was strong enough to walk. It was late afternoon when he stepped out onto the porch, leaning heavily on Lydia's shoulder. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the desert in its usual spectacular array of violets and golds. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of sage and the faint, lingering smell of charred wood. Taza stopped at the railing. He looked out over his land. The damage was extensive. The hay barn was a skeleton of blackened timbers. The fences were cut and twisted. The ground near the well was churned up by the hooves of battle. It looked like a scar on the face of the valley. Lydia watched him, anxious. She knew how much this place meant to him. It was not just dirt. It was his history, his defiance against a world that wanted him erased. She expected rage. She expected grief. Instead, Taza took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of his home. "They missed the best parts," he said quietly. Lydia looked at him, surprised. "They burned the winter feed. Taza, they poisoned the well. Though Nokai says we can clean it, it will take months to rebuild." Taza turned to her. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed the skin of her neck, sending a shiver through her. "They burned what they could see," Taza said. "Wood, grass, fences. Those are just things. Things can be built again. They did not touch what matters." "What matters?" Lydia asked. "The root," Taza said, gesturing to the ground. "The water deep down. The spirit of the horses. And us." He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "They tried to burn the courage out of us, Lydia, and instead, they forged it harder. Fire cleans the land. It makes way for new grass." Lydia looked at the blackened ruins and saw them through his eyes. It was not the end. It was a clearing. A rider appeared on the road, approaching the house at a respectful trot. It was a man in a dark suit, carrying a leather portfolio. He was flanked by 2 soldiers, but they stayed back at the gate. "That is the magistrate's man," Lydia said, recognizing the official seal on the saddlebag. Taza stiffened slightly, his old wariness returning. "More paper, more lies." "No," Lydia said, placing a hand on his arm. "Not this time. This time. You have a translator who knows their tricks." The official, a man named Mr. Henderson, was polite and businesslike. He declined the offer of water, choosing to stand on the porch steps while Taza sat in the rocking chair, his rifle leaning within reach. "The territory wishes to formalize the arrangement regarding the aquifer," Henderson said, pulling a document from his case. "The railroad acknowledges that the initial survey was aggressive. Mr. Crowley acted without the full sanction of the board. He acted like a thief," Taza said flatly. "Indeed," Henderson said, not meeting Taza's eyes. "However, the railroad still needs water. The board is prepared to offer a contract. They will pay a monthly lease for access to the lower well. They will run a pipe 2 miles east to their depot. In exchange, they will recognize your title to this land in perpetuity, protected by federal law." He handed the paper to Taza. Taza looked at the dense, cramping script. He could read English, but the legal jargon was a language designed to entrap. He handed it to Lydia without a word. Lydia took the document. She read it slowly, her eyes narrowing. She had seen papers like this on her father's desk, the papers that had sold her into marriage. She knew where the traps were hidden. "Clause 4, Lydia said, looking up at Henderson. "It says, the railroad retains the right of eminent domain in cases of structural necessity. Strike that out." Henderson blinked. "Miss Hart, that is standard boilerplate." "Strike it out," Lydia repeated firmly. "Or there is no water." And Clause 7. "The payment is fixed. It needs to be adjusted for inflation every 5 years. And Taza retains the right to cut the flow if the ranch's needs are not met first." Henderson looked from Lydia to Taza. He saw the set of Lydia's jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. He saw the way Taza watched her, trusting her completely with his future. "Very well," Henderson sighed, taking out a fountain pen. "We can make those amendments." Lydia spent the next hour negotiating. She fought for every inch of rights, every dollar of compensation. She was relentless. She was protecting her home. When Henderson finally left, carrying the signed and amended contract, the sun was gone, leaving the sky a deep, velvety indigo. Taza looked at the paper copy Lydia held in her hand. "You speak their language better than they do." "I learned from the best thieves in Boston," Lydia said with a tired smile. They sat on the porch in the gathering dark. The air was still. The violence of the past week felt like a bad dream, fading in the light of the new reality. Lydia looked at Taza. He was healing. The contract was signed. The danger was gone. "You could go back," Taza said suddenly, his voice low. Lydia turned to him. "What?" "Crowley is finished," Taza said. He was looking at his hands. "His claim on you is void. The town knows you are a hero now, not a victim. You could take a stagecoach tomorrow, go back east, find a man who does not live in a burnt-out shack, find a life that is soft." Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking at the stars. They were brighter here than anywhere else on earth. She thought of Boston. She thought of the parlors, the tea, the endless, suffocating rules. She thought of being safe and bored and owned. Then she looked at the man sitting in the chair, a man who had offered his soul to save her. "I have been thinking," Lydia said softly. She turned to face him. "About the night in the cave." Taza went very still. "I told you I was a virgin," Lydia said. She felt the blush rise on her cheeks, but she did not look away. "And in the way the church means it, I suppose I was. I had never laid with a man." She walked back to him, stopping just inches from his knees. "But I realized something. Taza, I was not pure. I was sold. My father traded me for debt relief. Crowley bought me for prestige. My virtue was just a commodity on a ledger. She reached out and took his hand, placing it against her waist. Since that night, since I came here, I have never felt cleaner, she whispered. I have dirt under my nails, I have blood on my skirt, but I feel clean because I am free. Taza looked up at her. His eyes were dark and vulnerable. Lydia, he said, do you still want a child with me? Taza, Lydia asked. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with hope. Not as a shield against Crowley, not as a bargain for rent, but as a promise. Taza stood up slowly. He ignored the pain in his side. He towered over her, blocking out the stars. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. I told you once that a child is not a bargain, Taza said, his voice thick with emotion. And I was right. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. I do not want a child out of fear, he whispered. I do not want a child to prove a point to the white men. I want a child out of love. Lydia let out a breath she had been holding for a lifetime. And I love you. Lydia Hart. Taza said. The words were simple, spoken with the quiet certainty of the earth turning. I love you more than I love this land, because you are the heart of it now. Without you, this is just dirt. With you, it is a home. Lydia began to cry, silent tears of relief and joy. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest, careful of his wound. I am staying, she sobbed into his shirt. I am staying forever. Taza held her, his chin resting on the top of her head. He looked out at the dark. Ruined yard. He saw the work ahead, the fences to fix, the herd to rebuild, the prejudices they would still face. But for the first time in his life, the future did not look like a battle. It looked like a garden. We will build the barn bigger this time, Taza said softly, rocking her gently. And we will dig the well deeper, and we will teach our son or our daughter how to shoot and how to read. Lydia laughed through her tears, pulling back to look at him. And how to negotiate contracts. Taza smiled, a true smile that reached his eyes. And how to negotiate contracts. He kissed her then. It was not the desperate kiss of the storm, nor the tragic kiss of the battlefield. It was a kiss at the beginning. Gentle, slow, and full of a promise that would outlast the iron rails and the red dust. They stood there for a long time in the moonlight, two survivors on the edge of the world, making a silent pact with the night. The war was over. The building had begun. The Arizona autumn arrived not with a whimper, but with a golden clarity that seemed to scrub the sky clean of the summer's violence. 3 months had passed since the night of the fire, and the land, resilient as the people who tended it, had begun to heal. The blackened scar where the hay barn once stood was gone, replaced by the skeletal frame of a new structure, twice the size of the old one, built from sturdy pine hauled down from the high country. The fences, once cut in twisted wire, now stood straight and taut, marking a boundary that the town of Dustwater had learned to respect. To the east, the rhythmic clang of sledgehammers on iron spikes echoed through the valley, but it was a distant, non-threatening sound. The railroad was coming. Yes, but it was keeping its distance. Under the new contract Lydia had negotiated, the tracks curved wide around the Taza claim, a respectful arc of steel that acknowledged the sovereignty of the Apache ranch. The water flowed through the pipes to the depot, measured and paid for, a lifeline shared rather than stolen. Lydia Hart sat on the stone rim of the well, the cool sandstone pressing against her palms. The water below was clear again, the oil and poison flushed out by weeks of labor and the natural filtration of the deep earth. She rested one hand on her abdomen. It was a subtle curve, barely noticeable beneath her calico work dress, but to her, it felt like the center of the universe. She closed her eyes, the memory of the cave washing over her. The rain, the firelight, the desperate, defiant vow she had made when she felt like she had nothing left to trade but her body. I will carry your child. Back then, it had been a weapon, a way to bind herself to the land so she could not be torn away. It had been a terrifying leap into the unknown. Now, sitting in the quiet morning sun, she realized the vow had transformed. It was no longer a shield. It was a seed. She was not afraid. The panic that had defined her flight from Boston, the shame that had followed her through the streets of Dustwater, was gone. In its place was a profound, quiet strength, anchored by the life growing inside her. The sound of hoofbeats approached. Taza rode into the yard on his paint horse, his saddlebags heavy with supplies from town. He dismounted with that fluid grace that never ceased to make Lydia's breath catch. He wore a new shirt, clean buckskin, but he still carried the Winchester in his scabbard. Peace had come, but an Apache did not forget the nature of the world. He tied the horse and walked toward her. He saw her hand on her stomach, the contemplative tilt of her head. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. "You are quiet today," Taza said. His voice had lost the harsh edge of their early days. It was warm, like the sun on the canyon walls. Lydia looked up, shielding her eyes. "I was thinking about promises." Taza sat down on the rim of the well beside her. He took off his hat, turning it in his hands. The scar on his side from the bullet wound had healed into a jagged ridge, a permanent reminder of the night he had died and come back for her. "We have kept our promises," Taza said. "The land is safe. The herd is growing." "There is one more promise," Lydia said softly. She took his hand, the one that was calloused and scarred from years of fighting and working, and placed it flat against her stomach. Taza froze. He looked at his hand, then up at her face, his dark eyes widening. He did not speak. He did not pull away. He simply stared, the realization dawning in the depths of his gaze. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "I am sure," Lydia said. "Spring. We will have a baby in the spring." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind in the sagebrush. Taza did not shout. He did not laugh. The emotion that filled him was too large for noise. It was a sacred thing. He slid off the well rim, dropping to his knees in the red dust. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pressed his forehead against her stomach. Lydia wove her fingers through his long, dark hair, feeling the tremble in his shoulders. He began to speak, not in English, but in the language of his people. It was a low, rhythmic chant, a prayer vibrating against her skin. Lydia did not know the words, but she understood the meaning. He was introducing the child to the earth. He was telling the ancestors that a new link in the chain had been forged. He was offering his protection, his strength, and his soul to the life they had created. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "A son," Taza said, his voice thick, "or a daughter, it does not matter. They will walk this land freely." "They will be Apache," Lydia said, echoing his words from months ago. "And they will be heart," Taza corrected her gently. "They will have your fire and your stubbornness." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, under a sky so blue it looked like painted porcelain. It was not a ceremony that belonged to any single god or government. It was a weaving of two worlds. They stood beneath the great cottonwood tree near the creek, the leaves turning a brilliant yellow. Nokai officiated the Apache rites. He tied their hands together with a strip of leather tanned from the hide of a deer Taza had hunted. He offered them a gourd of water from the well they had fought to save. "Drink," Nokai said, "so you will never thirst alone. Water is life. You share your life now." They drank, the cool water sealing the pact. Then, Dr. Miller, who also served as the town's justice of the peace, stepped forward. He looked at the couple, the Apache rancher in his ceremonial buckskins and the Boston lady in a simple dress of cream lace she had sewn herself. "Do you, Lydia Hart, take this man?" Dr. Miller asked, his voice wavering slightly with emotion. "I take him," Lydia said, her voice clear and ringing across the yard. "Until the last cattle runs these fields? Until the mountains wear down to dust? And do you, Taza, take this woman?" "I take her," Taza said, looking only at Lydia. "With my blood, with my breath, with my soul." The guests were a strange mixture. There were Apache warriors standing stoic and proud near the barn. There were cowboys from neighboring ranches who had once looked down on Taza but now tipped their hats to his resilience. There was the baker's wife, who wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Even the new sheriff, a stern but fair man sent from Tucson, stood by the gate, nodding his approval. There was no Sheriff Briggs. He was gone, a ghost of the old corruption. And there was no Silas Crowley. 2 days after the wedding, a final piece of the past was swept away. Lydia stood on the porch, watching a cloud of dust move along the road toward the east. It was a prison transport wagon, flanked by 4 marshals. Inside the wagon sat a man with a shattered shoulder and a ruined name. Silas Crowley had been found guilty of fraud, arson, and attempted murder. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed. He was being transported to the federal penitentiary in Yuma. Taza came up behind Lydia, wrapping his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. They watched the wagon disappear into the heat haze. "Do you hate him?" Taza asked quietly. Lydia watched the dust settle. She thought of the fear she had felt on the stagecoach. She thought of the letter from her mother. She thought of the fire. "No," Lydia said. "Hate takes too much energy, and I need my energy for building." She leaned back into Taza's embrace. "He is just a shadow." "Taza, and it is high noon. There are no shadows now." In the months that followed, the ranch became something more than just a house. It became a sanctuary. Nokai and his family moved their lodge closer to the main house, setting up near the creek. Other Apache families, displaced by the railroad or wary of the reservation, began to drift toward the valley. Taza did not turn them away. He gave them work, he gave them space, and he gave them dignity. But white settlers came too, men who were tired of the corruption of the big outfits. Looking for honest work, Taza hired them. It was a delicate balance, a friction of cultures that required constant tending. Taza was the iron hand that kept the peace, the leader who commanded respect from both sides because he was faster with a gun and fairer with a dollar than anyone else. Lydia became the voice. She sat on the porch with the wives of the settlers and the Apache women, translating not just words, but worlds. She taught the Apache children to read English from her few remaining books. She learned to weave baskets and grind corn from Nokai's wife. She was the bridge. And as her belly grew round and heavy with the promise of spring, she became the symbol of what was possible. One late afternoon, when the work was done and the sun was beginning its descent, Taza found Lydia near the paddock. She was watching the horses run. The herd had doubled in size, sleek and strong, their coats shining in the amber light. Taza walked up to her, placing a hand on the small of her back. The baby kicked, a strong, sudden movement against her ribs. Lydia laughed, a sound of pure delight. "He is restless today," Lydia said. "He knows the sun is going down." Taza smiled. "It is time for running." They stood together, watching the horizon turn a deep, violent red, streaked with purple and gold. It was the color of the desert, the color of blood, the color of passion. Lydia turned to face her husband. She reached up and touched the silver concho he wore at his throat. "I used to be so afraid of this land," she confessed. "I thought it was empty. I thought it wanted to kill me." "It is not empty," Taza said, looking out at the vast expanse. "It is full of ghosts, and stories, and us," Lydia added. She took his hand and placed it over the child again. The baby moved under his palm, a greeting. "Taza," she said softly, "do you remember what you said that night in the cave when I offered to carry your child?" Taza nodded, his eyes darkening with the memory of the rain and the fire. "I said that if you carried my child, I would carry your soul with mine." Lydia smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "I gave you my soul that night in the fire. Taza, when I picked up that rifle, when I chose you over everything I had ever known." She looked down at where his hand rested on their unborn child. "This child," she whispered, "this is the proof that you gave me yours." Taza pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that defied the hardness of the world around them. "We are one soul now," he murmured against her lips. Broken and put back together, stronger at the broken places. The sun finally slipped below the rim of the world, plunging the valley into the cool, blue twilight. From the Apache camp down by the creek, the sound of a drum began a slow, steady heartbeat. A song rose up, drifting on the wind. A song of thanks for the day and protection for the night. From the bunkhouse, the sound of a fiddle joined in, a cowboy tune that mingled strangely but sweetly with the chant. Lydia laughed, the sound ringing out from the porch, clear and free. Taza smiled, the weight of the years lifting from his shoulders. The West was a hard place. It demanded payment in sweat, in blood, and in grief. It belonged to the cruel and the greedy for a time. But in the end, the story suggested, the land did not belong to the railroad barons or the politicians. It belonged to those who had the courage to love it, to those who could look at the dust and see a garden, to those who were brave enough to bind their souls to another and stand firm when the fire came. Lydia and Taza had paid the price. They had walked through the fire, and as the stars began to wheel overhead, indifferent and magnificent, they knew they had found the only thing in the Wild West worth dying for. They had found a life worth living, and under the vast, watching sky, the Apache rancher and his bride turned and walked into their home, leaving the door open to the night, afraid of nothing. Thank you so much for listening to the story, I'll Carry Your Child. The virgin vowed, the Apache rancher offered her his soul in return. I hope Lydia and Taza's journey touched your heart as much as it did mine. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from. I would love to connect with you and hear your thoughts on the ending. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and hit the hype button so more people can hear this story. Your support helps me keep these campfire stories alive. Thank you, and happy trails.